In a divided small town, a successful black CEO, Jamal Carter, faces relentless racism when he tries to build a community center aimed at fostering inclusion and opportunity. Officer Daniels, a corrupt and openly racist figure, manipulates the system to block Jamal's vision, fabricating evidence and rallying resistance fueled by fear and prejudice. As Jamal battles systemic bias, he endures public humiliation, false accusations, and overt attempts to undermine his efforts. This gripping tale exposes the infuriating depths of racism in America and highlights the personal toll of fighting for justice against a corrupt, prejudiced system. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above as Elijah Carter stood before the council room of Ashton Heights Historical Society. The polished mahogany table stretched long and wide, a symbol of the exclusivity that defined this small town. Around it sat 12 council members, their expressions ranging from skeptical to outright dismissive. "Elijah," began Margaret Caldwell, the council president, her voice laced with a polite condescension. "We appreciate your proposal, but Ashton Heights prides itself on preserving its traditions. A community center in the heart of our historic district. Well, it simply doesn't align with the town's identity." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, his presence was as commanding as it was calm. "With respect, Mrs. Caldwell, this isn't about erasing tradition, it's about expanding it. Ashton Heights has a rich history, yes, but it's also a town in need of progress. A community center can be a bridge, a place where the past and future coexist." Margaret glanced at the others, her expression unreadable. "You're asking us to approve a project that will bring in outsiders. That's not what Ashton Heights is about." Elijah met her gaze, unwavering. "Outsiders? You mean residents who already live here but have never been invited to the table? This center isn't for outsiders, Mrs. Caldwell. It's for all of us." A ripple of unease moved through the room. Elijah could feel the weight of their resistance, but he also saw something else, a flicker of doubt in the eyes of one or two members. As Margaret leaned forward to deliver another rebuttal, Elijah knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of his fight to create a space where everyone, not just a select few, could belong. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air as Jamal Carter walked into Millbrook's Main Street diner. He was dressed in a simple gray sweater and dark jeans, his polished leather shoes clicking softly against the scuffed tile floor. The diner wasn't crowded. A few patrons sat at the counter, nursing their morning cups of coffee, while others occupied booths by the large windows overlooking the sleepy street. Jamal paused just inside the door, letting the warmth of the diner thaw the chill that clung to the crisp autumn morning. To anyone watching, he was just another face in the crowd, a man grabbing breakfast in a small town. And that was exactly how he wanted it. Though Jamal owned one of the most successful logistics companies in the state, his weekends in Millbrook were spent quietly. No chauffeur, no tailored suits, just good food, quiet reflection, and an escape from the relentless pace of city life. "Take a seat wherever you like," called out the waitress behind the counter, her voice cheerful but distracted as she balanced a pot of coffee and a tray of pastries. Jamal chose a booth near the back, away from the chatter of the regulars. The vinyl seat creaked under his weight as he settled in, placing his phone face down on the table. He pulled out a notebook and a pen from his coat pocket, an old habit he'd never abandoned. His mornings were often spent scribbling ideas, thoughts, or plans for the future. Today, however, his mind wandered to a topic far heavier than his usual business strategies. Millbrook was a town of contradictions. Its historic charm, the red brick courthouse, quaint shops, and tree-lined streets, masked a deeper struggle. Beneath its picturesque exterior lay a community grappling with change, where progress clashed with tradition, and where people like Jamal often felt like outsiders despite their success. The door jingled as two men entered, their boots heavy against the floor. Jamal glanced up briefly. The men were in their late 40s, wearing faded work jackets and baseball caps that bore the logo of a local mill. They nodded at the waitress before scanning the room. When their eyes landed on Jamal, their casual demeanor shifted. The older of the two whispered something to his companion, and both exchanged a look Jamal had seen too many times before, a mixture of curiosity and quiet disapproval. Jamal returned his attention to his notebook, his pen hovering over the blank page. He'd long since learned not to react, it wasn't worth the energy. But even as he tried to focus, he could feel their stares lingering a moment too long before they moved to a booth near the counter. The waitress arrived at his table, her smile warm and practiced. "Morning, hon, what can I get for you?" "Just coffee and the breakfast special," Jamal replied, offering a polite smile. "Coming right up," she said, scribbling on her notepad. "Be back in a jiffy." Jamal leaned back, taking in the room. The diner had a comfortable, lived-in feel. Faded photographs of Millbrook from decades past hung on the walls, alongside a dusty bulletin board, cluttered with flyers for bake sales, church events, and town meetings. It was the kind of place where time seemed to move a little slower, where stories were passed over coffee refills and hash browns. It was also the kind of place where outsiders were noticed, and often scrutinized. Jamal's gaze shifted to the window. Outside, a group of kids darted past on their bikes, their laughter cutting through the stillness of the morning. Across the street, a woman swept the steps of the library, her scarf fluttering in the wind. It was a picture of small-town life that Jamal had always appreciated, even if he didn't always feel like he belonged in it. His coffee arrived quickly, steam curling from the mug as he wrapped his hands around its warmth. He took a sip, letting the bitterness ground him. As he reached for his notebook again, a shadow fell over his table. "Morning," came a gruff voice. Jamal looked up to see the two men standing by his booth. The older one, a burly man with a salt-and-pepper beard, had his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. The younger man stood slightly behind him, his expression guarded. "Good morning," Jamal replied evenly. "You from around here?" the older man asked, his tone casual but laced with something unspoken. Jamal placed his pen down slowly. "I spend weekends here sometimes. It's a nice town." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, as if assessing him. "Didn't think I'd seen you before? What brings you to Millbrook?" Jamal met his gaze without flinching. "Just enjoying a quiet morning, same as anyone else." The younger man shifted on his feet, glancing toward the counter, where the waitress was watching the exchange with thinly veiled curiosity. The older man gave a small, humorless chuckle. "Quiet morning, huh? Don't get many city folks looking for quiet out here." Jamal smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe that's why I like it." The man stared at him for another moment before nodding. "Well, you have a good day now?" "You too," Jamal replied, his voice calm but firm. As the men walked back to their booth, Jamal picked up his pen again, but the ease of the morning had been replaced with a quiet tension. It wasn't the first time he'd been the subject of scrutiny in a place like this, and it wouldn't be the last. He'd built his life on rising above moments like these. But that didn't mean they didn't leave a mark. When his breakfast arrived, Jamal forced himself to focus on the task at hand. He flipped open his notebook and began jotting down ideas for the new community center his company was funding in Millbrook. It was an ambitious project, one that promised to bring resources and opportunities to the area. But if this morning's encounter was any indication, it wouldn't come without resistance. As he worked, the bell above the door jingled again. This time, the newcomer was a man in a crisp uniform, Officer Daniels, Millbrook's sheriff. Jamal recognized him immediately. Daniels was a fixture in the town, known for his strict adherence to the old ways and his less than welcoming attitude toward change. Daniels scanned the room, his gaze landing on Jamal. A slow smile spread across his face, though it lacked any warmth. He approached the counter, exchanged a few words with the waitress, then made his way to Jamal's table. "Well, well," Daniels drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "Didn't expect to see you here." Jamal set his pen down again, his expression neutral. "Morning, officer." Daniels leaned against the edge of the booth, his hands resting on his belt. "You must be Mr. Carter. Heard you've been stirring things up around town with that fancy community project of yours." "I wouldn't call it stirring things up," Jamal replied evenly. "I'm just trying to give back." Daniels chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "Well, some folks around here don't take kindly to outsiders coming in and telling us how to run our town." Jamal met his gaze, unflinching. "It's not about telling anyone how to run their town, it's about providing opportunities. Something I think we can all agree is a good thing." Daniel's smile tightened. "We'll see about that." As Daniel straightened up and walked away, Jamal felt the weight of the encounter settle over him. It was a familiar feeling, a quiet reminder that no matter how far he'd come, there were still places where he'd be seen as an outsider first and a man second. He took another sip of his coffee, his mind already turning to the challenges ahead. Jamal Carter finished his breakfast in silence, the weight of Officer Daniels' words lingering in his mind. The sheriff's tone had been unmistakable, a warning, cloaked in the pretense of small-town hospitality. It was a sentiment Jamal had encountered too many times before. Outsiders, especially those who looked like him, were welcome only if they stayed in their place. As he signed the check and stood to leave, the conversations in the diner quieted. Just for a moment, Jamal could feel the subtle shift in the room, the glances exchanged between the regulars, the whispered comments behind half-raised coffee mugs. He tucked his notebook back into his coat pocket and nodded to the waitress on his way out. "Thanks for coming in," she said, her voice polite but strained. The door jingled as he stepped onto the sidewalk. The autumn air was brisk, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from chimneys along the street. Jamal's car, a sleek black sedan, was parked just a few steps away. It stood out among the older pickups and sedans, its polished exterior a silent testament to his success. As he approached, he noticed Daniels leaning against his patrol car across the street, arms crossed, watching him. The sheriff made no effort to hide his scrutiny, his eyes tracking Jamal's every move. Jamal unlocked his car and climbed inside, forcing himself to remain calm. He started the engine, the purr of the motor cutting through the quiet street, and pulled away from the curb. In his rearview mirror, he saw Daniels climb into his own vehicle, the flashing lights coming on as the patrol car eased into traffic behind him. The sheriff followed Jamal all the way to the edge of town, keeping just close enough to make his presence felt. Jamal's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he tried to ignore the growing sense of unease. He reminded himself to stay composed, to avoid giving Daniels any excuse to escalate. When he finally reached the property he'd come to inspect, a vacant lot on the outskirts of Millbrook, he parked and stepped out. The land was overgrown with weeds, but its potential was undeniable. It was the site he'd chosen for the new community center, a project he'd poured months of planning and funding into. Daniels pulled up moments later, his tires crunching on the gravel. He stepped out of the car, his hand resting on his belt, the badge on his chest gleaming in the sunlight. "Something I can help you with, officer?" Jamal asked, keeping his tone neutral. Daniel shrugged, taking a slow look around the property. "Just seemed odd, you driving out here. Figured I'd make sure everything was on the up and up." "I'm here for work," Jamal replied. "This lot is part of a project I'm funding." Daniel smirked, the condescension in his expression unmistakable. "Must be nice, having the kind of money to throw around on projects like this. But you might want to reconsider. Folks around here don't like their town being turned into, well, something it's not." Jamal crossed his arms, meeting Daniel's gaze. "And what do you think this town is, Sheriff?" Daniels didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past Jamal, scanning the lot as if searching for a reason to escalate. "It's a place with traditions, a way of life that doesn't need outsiders coming in and stirring things up." "I'm not here to stir anything up," Jamal said, his voice steady. "I'm here to contribute, to invest in this community." Daniels took a step closer, his voice lowering. "Let me give you some advice. Not everyone here's gonna see it that way. Might be better for everyone if you just took your business somewhere else." Jamal felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but he forced it down. He knew better than to let Daniels goad him. "Thank you for the advice, officer. But I'll make my own decisions about where and how I invest." Daniels stared at him for a moment longer, then stepped back, a faint sneer on his lips. "Suit yourself, but don't say I didn't warn you." With that, he turned and walked back to his patrol car, slamming the door shut before driving off. Jamal stood there for a long moment, the weight of the encounter settling over him. He took a deep breath, trying to shake the feeling of helplessness that clung to him like a shadow. By the time Jamal returned to his office later that afternoon, he was mentally drained. His assistant, Erica, greeted him with her usual efficiency, handing him a stack of messages and a schedule update. "You've got a call with the architects in 15 minutes, she said, glancing at him with a hint of concern. "Everything okay?" Jamal forced a smile. Just a long morning, that's all. He stepped into his office, a sleek and modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Atlanta skyline. It was a far cry from the small-town diner he'd started his day in, and for a moment, the contrast was almost jarring. As he sat at his desk, his phone buzzed with a text from his project manager detailing the next steps for the community center. Jamal replied quickly, his mind already shifting back into work mode. But even as he focused on the tasks at hand, the memory of Daniel's words lingered. The following week, Jamal returned to Millbrook for a town meeting about the community center. The room was packed, with residents filling every available seat. Jamal stood near the front, listening as the mayor introduced the project and opened the floor for comments. At first, the feedback was polite, but skeptical. Questions about funding, the scope of the project, and its impact on local businesses were raised, and Jamal answered each one calmly and thoroughly. But as the meeting progressed, the tone began to shift. "This isn't the kind of thing we need here," one man said, his voice rising. "We don't want our town turning into some city playground." "That's not what this project is about," Jamal replied. "It's about providing resources for everyone in the community, jobs, education, and a safe space for families." "Sounds like you're just trying to make a name for yourself," another voice muttered from the back of the room. Jamal turned toward the sound, his jaw tightening. "I'm not here for recognition, I'm here because I believe in the potential of this town. This center isn't about me, it's about all of us." Before he could say more, Daniel stood up from where he'd been leaning against the wall, his presence commanding attention. "You say it's for the community," the sheriff drawled, "but not everyone here thinks we need it. Maybe you're trying to fix something that isn't broken." The murmurs of agreement from a small group in the audience were like a punch to Jamal's gut. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "With respect, Officer Daniels, providing opportunities for growth isn't about fixing something broken, it's about building something better. And I think we can all agree that every town deserves that chance." Daniel smirked, but before he could respond, the mayor interjected, calling for order. Jamal's words hung in the air, the tension in the room thick and unyielding. As the meeting concluded, Jamal made his way out of the building, feeling the stares of those who still doubted his intentions. Outside, the night was cool and quiet, but the unease from the day followed him like a shadow. He knew this was just the beginning. The resistance he'd faced today was a small glimpse of the challenges ahead. But as he climbed into his car, Jamal reminded himself why he'd taken on this fight: to build something lasting, not just for himself, but for everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong. Jamal Carter stood in the dimly lit foyer of Millbrook's town hall, his mind racing. The meeting had ended hours ago, but the tension it stirred lingered like a storm cloud. Despite his calm responses and thorough explanations, it was clear that a significant portion of the town didn't want the community center to become a reality. The resistance wasn't just about the project, it was about him, a black man with power and influence, challenging the status quo. As he turned to leave, the sound of approaching footsteps caught his attention. It was Mitchell Harper, one of the town council members. A wiry man in his 60s, Mitchell had been one of the few who'd publicly voiced support for Jamal's vision. "Mr. Carter," Mitchell called out, his voice low. He glanced around nervously before continuing. "Do you have a moment?" Jamal paused, nodding. "Of course, what's on your mind?" Mitchell hesitated, then leaned closer, his expression guarded. "I think you should know there's been talk. Among certain people in town, they're not just opposed to the center. They're actively looking for ways to shut it down." Jamal raised an eyebrow, his pulse quickening. "What kind of ways?" Mitchell glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear. "They're saying you've overstepped. That this project is a disruption to the community. I've even heard whispers about digging into your background, trying to find something, anything, they can use against you." Jamal's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "That's not surprising. People resist change, especially when it threatens their comfort." "It's more than that," Mitchell said urgently. "I heard Daniels talking with some of the council members after the meeting. He's convinced you're trouble, and he's not above bending the rules to make sure others believe it." Jamal nodded, a flicker of gratitude in his chest, despite the warning. "Thanks for letting me know, Mitchell. I appreciate your support." Mitchell frowned, his eyes filled with worry. "Just be careful Daniels doesn't play fair." Jamal offered a reassuring smile, though his mind was already strategizing. I will. And don't worry. This project isn't going anywhere. The next morning, Jamal drove to the construction site for a scheduled meeting with his team. As he pulled onto the gravel lot, he noticed 2 patrol cars parked near the site entrance. His stomach sank. Officer Daniels was leaning against his cruiser, flanked by 2 deputies. Jamal stepped out of his car, his expression calm but alert. He approached the group, his shoulders squared. "Morning, Officer Daniels," he said evenly. "Something I can help you with?" Daniels pushed off the cruiser, a smug smile on his face. "Morning, Mr. Carter. We received a report about some unauthorized activity on this property. Thought we'd come check it out." Jamal's eyebrows lifted. "Unauthorized? This land is legally owned by my company, and all necessary permits have been filed. There's nothing unauthorized happening here." Daniel's smile didn't waver. "That's so. Mind if we take a look around?" Jamal folded his arms. "You're welcome to look, but you won't find anything out of order." Daniels nodded to his deputies, who began walking the perimeter of the site. He turned back to Jamal, his tone dripping with mock friendliness. "You know, Mr. Carter, it's admirable what you're trying to do here, but sometimes, big ideas don't fit small towns. Folks around here like things the way they are." Jamal met his gaze, unflinching. "Progress isn't about what's easy, officer. It's about what's right," Daniels chuckled, shaking his head. "We'll see how long that attitude lasts." Minutes later, one of the deputies returned, holding a small bag filled with what appeared to be pills. "Found this over by the equipment shed," the deputy announced loudly. Jamal's stomach dropped as Daniels's face lit up with feigned surprise. "Well, now that's interesting." "That's ridiculous," Jamal said, his voice rising. "Those weren't there yesterday, and you know it." Daniels shrugged. "I don't know anything, Mr. Carter, but it's my duty to investigate." Jamal's fists clenched at his sides. "This is a setup, and we both know it. You're trying to sabotage this project." Daniels stepped closer, his expression hardening. "Careful, Mr. Carter. Accusing a law enforcement officer of misconduct is a serious allegation." Jamal took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay composed. "I'll be contacting my lawyer. This won't hold up." Daniels smirked. "You do that? In the meantime, I suggest you stay out of trouble." By the time Jamal arrived back at his office in Atlanta, he was seething. He sat at his desk, his hands gripping the edge of the polished wood as he replayed the morning's events in his mind. It was an orchestrated attack, plain and simple. Daniels wasn't just trying to intimidate him. He was actively working to destroy everything Jamal had built. Erica entered the room cautiously, holding a stack of papers. "Mr. Carter, is everything okay?" Jamal sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Not exactly. I need you to get our legal team on the phone immediately." Erica nodded, her concern evident. "Of course, anything else?" "Draft a statement for the press," Jamal added. "If Daniels thinks I'm going to let this go quietly, he's in for a surprise." 2 days later, Jamal held a press conference outside the Millbrook courthouse. Reporters from local and regional outlets gathered as he stepped up to the podium, flanked by his attorney and project manager. "Good afternoon," Jamal began, his voice steady and resolute. "I stand before you today not just as a businessman, but as a citizen who believes in the potential of this community. The allegations made against me and my project are baseless and defamatory. They are an attempt to distract from the real issue: systemic resistance to progress." Cameras flashed, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jamal continued, his gaze sweeping over the gathered reporters. "This community center is not just a building. It's a promise, a commitment to providing resources, opportunities, and hope for everyone in Millbrook. But there are those who fear change, who see progress as a threat rather than an opportunity. To them, I say this: I will not be intimidated, I will not be silenced, and I will not stop fighting for what's right." As Jamal stepped away from the podium, the questions came fast and furious. He answered each one calmly, refusing to let the tension shake him. But as he returned to his car, his phone buzzed with a text from Mitchell. "Be careful, Daniels is rallying support from the council. They're voting tomorrow to shut down your permits." Jamal stared at the screen, his resolve hardening. It was clear now. Daniels and his allies wouldn't stop until they dismantled everything he was working for. But Jamal wasn't about to let them win. The next morning, Jamal arrived at the council chambers early, his legal team in tow. The room was already filling with spectators, many of whom eyed him with open hostility. At the front of the room, Daniels sat beside the mayor, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. As the meeting began, the mayor outlined the council's concerns, citing community unrest and potential zoning violations as reasons to reconsider the project. It was a thinly veiled attack, but Jamal was ready. When it was his turn to speak, Jamal rose from his seat, his presence commanding the room. He laid out his case with precision, countering each accusation with facts and evidence. But as he spoke, he could see the council members shifting uncomfortably, their minds already made up. Finally, Daniels stood, his voice dripping with condescension. "With all due respect, Mr. Carter, this project isn't what's best for Millbrook. Maybe it's time to accept that and move on." Jamal's gaze burned into Daniels. "And with all due respect, Sheriff, this project is what's best for Millbrook, whether you want to admit it or not." The tension in the room was palpable as the council prepared to vote. Jamal sat back, his heart pounding, knowing that everything he'd worked for was hanging by a thread. The air in the council chambers felt oppressive, heavy with tension and anticipation. Jamal Carter sat at the defense table, his shoulders squared and his expression calm, though his mind was racing. The council's vote would determine the fate of the community center he had poured months of effort into, a project meant to bridge gaps and create opportunities in a town that sorely needed them. But this wasn't just about a building. It was about standing up to the entrenched systems of bias that had tried, time and time again, to undermine him. Across the room, Officer Daniels sat smugly, his arms crossed over his chest. The self-satisfied smirk he wore was infuriating, but it was also telling Daniels thought he had already won. He thought the network of resistance he had built behind closed doors, the whispers, the false accusations, the weaponized fear, was enough to break Jamal. But Jamal wasn't breaking. The council president, Margaret Caldwell, cleared her throat, her voice slicing through the quiet hum of the room. "We will now hear closing statements from both sides before moving to a vote." Jamal stood, adjusting his suit jacket. The room was packed, every seat filled with curious onlookers, skeptics, and a few steadfast allies. He stepped to the podium, letting his gaze sweep across the audience before speaking. "Good evening," Jamal began, his voice steady and resonant. "I'm here tonight not as an outsider, but as someone who believes deeply in the potential of Millbrook. The community center isn't just a project for me. It's a promise to every child who dreams of something more, every family who deserves a place to grow, and every individual who has ever felt overlooked or left behind." His words hung in the air, drawing murmurs from the crowd. Daniels shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. "I understand that change can be uncomfortable," Jamal continued. "It challenges traditions and forces us to confront things we'd rather ignore. But Millbrook doesn't have to be stuck in the past. It can be a beacon of progress, a place where tradition and innovation coexist. That's what this center represents." He paused, meeting the eyes of the council members one by one. "I urge you to consider what kind of legacy you want to leave. Do you want to be remembered as the leaders who clung to fear and exclusion, or as the ones who chose to build something lasting, something that benefits everyone?" Before Margaret could respond, Daniel stood abruptly, drawing the room's attention. He sauntered to the front, feigning casual authority as he addressed the room. "With all due respect," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "Mr. Carter's vision might sound noble, but let's be honest. It's not what's best for this town. We're a small community with a way of life that works. Bringing in a flashy project like this, it's disruptive. It's not who we are." Daniels turned to the crowd, his tone shifting to one of feigned camaraderie. "And let's not ignore the concerns we've all heard. This project isn't just about a building, it's about bringing in elements that could change Millbrook forever, and not for the better." Jamal's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his expression neutral. Daniels was playing to fear, stoking the very biases that had hindered progress for decades. Margaret straightened in her seat, her expression carefully composed. "Thank you, Officer Daniels. We'll now proceed to the vote." The council members began casting their votes, their faces betraying a mixture of uncertainty and discomfort. Mitchell Harper, seated at the far end of the table, caught Jamal's eye and gave him a faint nod, an unspoken promise of support. But as the votes were tallied, it became clear that the scales were tipping in Daniel's favor. The council was divided, their fear of upsetting the town's delicate balance outweighing their willingness to embrace change. When the final vote was announced, the room erupted into hushed murmurs. "The motion to approve the community center has been denied," Margaret declared, her voice heavy with reluctance. Daniel's smirk widened as he leaned back in his chair, savoring his victory. The crowd began to disperse, some casting sympathetic glances at Jamal, others avoiding his gaze entirely. Mitchell approached him, his expression pained. "I'm sorry, Jamal, I did everything I could, but they're too afraid Daniels has them convinced this will ruin the town." Jamal nodded, his jaw tight. "Thanks, Mitchell, I appreciate your support." As Mitchell stepped away, Jamal turned to leave, but Daniels blocked his path. "Tough break, Carter," Daniels said, his voice low enough that only Jamal could hear. "Maybe now you'll think twice before trying to change things that don't need fixing." Jamal met his gaze, his voice calm but firm. "You haven't won, Daniels. Not in the way that matters." Daniels chuckled, stepping aside. "We'll see about that." The next morning, Jamal sat in his office, going over his options. The council's decision was a setback, but it wasn't the end. He'd been in tough situations before, and had always found a way forward. His thoughts were interrupted by Erica, who rushed in holding her phone. "Mr. Carter, you need to see this." She handed him the phone, which displayed a video taken at the council meeting the night before. The video wasn't of Jamal's speech or the vote. It was a recording of Daniels, caught on a hot mic during a private conversation with a fellow council member. "This Carter guy thinks he can just waltz in here and tell us what to do," Daniels said, his tone dripping with disdain. "We don't need his kind in Millbrook. If it takes bending the rules to keep him out, so be it." Jamal's chest tightened as he listened to the recording. The proof of Daniel's corruption was damning, and exactly what he needed to turn the tide. Jamal leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The recording was a game-changer, but how he used it would determine the outcome. This wasn't just about exposing Daniels, it was about reclaiming the narrative and forcing the town to confront its biases. He turned to Erica, his resolve hardening. "Get our legal team on the phone and contact the press, we're going public with this." Erica nodded, her expression fierce. "Consider it done." As she left the room, Jamal stood and gazed out the window, the Atlanta skyline a stark contrast to the small-town politics of Millbrook. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. Daniels had underestimated him, and that would be his downfall. Later that afternoon, Jamal stood before a group of reporters, the recording playing on a speaker for all to hear. The gasps and murmurs from the crowd were vindicating, but Jamal knew this was just the beginning. "This recording," he said, addressing the cameras, "is proof of the systemic corruption and bias that has plagued Millbrook for too long. But let me be clear. I'm not backing down. This community center will be built, and it will stand as a testament to the power of perseverance and justice." The reporters clamored for questions, but Jamal held up a hand. "The fight isn't over, and I promise you, I'm not going anywhere." As the press conference ended, Jamal felt a renewed sense of purpose. The stakes had never been higher, but he was ready for the battle ahead. Jamal Carter stood at the entrance of Millbrook Town Hall, his expression resolute, as he gazed at the building where so much resistance had been orchestrated against him. The press conference exposing Officer Daniels' corruption had created shockwaves, but Jamal knew that one recording wouldn't change everything. Daniels wasn't the type to go quietly, and Jamal wasn't naive enough to believe this fight was over. Inside the hall, the council had convened an emergency meeting in response to the backlash. Community members packed the gallery, their conversations a low hum of uncertainty. Some were outraged by the recording, while others clung to their long-held biases, insisting the tape was taken out of context. Jamal entered the chamber, his presence commanding attention as he walked to the podium. Officer Daniels was already there, seated near the council table, his arms crossed and his face a mask of smug defiance. The air between them crackled with tension. Daniels knew he was cornered, but his confidence suggested he still had cards to play. The council president, Margaret Caldwell, banged her gavel to bring the room to order. This meeting has been called to address recent events surrounding the proposed community center and the allegations raised against Officer Daniels. Allegations? Jamal repeated, stepping forward. You've all heard the recording. There's no allegation here. It's proof of systemic bias and corruption. Daniels smirked, leaning back in his chair. Proof? That's one interpretation, Mr. Carter, or it could just be a snippet taken out of context. Anyone who knows me knows I've always had this town's best interests at heart. The gallery erupted with murmurs, and Jamal felt a flash of anger. He stepped to the center of the room, his voice calm but firm. Best interests. Let's be clear, Officer Daniels. Your words weren't about protecting this town. They were about keeping it under your control. You're not just opposing the community center, you're opposing progress, inclusion, and anything that challenges your version of Millbrook. Daniels stood, his face darkening. You think you can waltz in here and lecture me about this town? I've been protecting Millbrook long before you decided it was your personal pet project. Jamal took a step closer, his gaze locked on Daniels. Protecting Millbrook, or protecting the status quo that keeps people like you in power and people like me out? The tension in the room was electric. Daniels' hands clenched into fists, but he quickly forced a sneer onto his face. Big words for someone who doesn't even belong here. Before Jamal could respond, a voice rang out from the gallery. That's enough. It was Mitchell Harper, the council member who had quietly supported Jamal throughout his fight. He rose from his seat, holding up a folder. I've been looking into this, and it's not just the recording that's damning, Daniels. I've found documentation, emails, meeting notes, even reports you filed with the sheriff's department. You've been using your position to intimidate and manipulate people into opposing the community center. The room erupted in gasps and whispers, Daniels' face twisted with rage as Mitchell handed the folder to the council president. Margaret flipped through the papers, her expression growing darker with each page. This is serious, Officer Daniels, she said, her voice sharp. If these documents are accurate, they suggest not only misconduct but also a deliberate attempt to undermine this community's progress. Daniels' mask of confidence cracked. You're taking his side now? He snarled, pointing at Jamal. You're going to believe an outsider over someone who's dedicated his life to this town? Margaret fixed him with a stern glare. This isn't about sides, it's about the truth. Daniels turned back to Jamal, his composure completely gone. You think you've won, don't you? He hissed. You think this little project of yours is going to change anything? You'll never be one of us. You'll always be an outsider. Jamal stepped forward, his voice steady and cutting. I don't need to be one of you to make a difference. This isn't about fitting into your narrow definition of belonging. It's about building a better future for everyone. Daniels laughed bitterly, shaking his head. You don't get it. People like me, people who've been here their whole lives, we're the backbone of this town, not some flashy businessman with big ideas and deep pockets. Maybe that's the problem, Jamal shot back. You've built your power on exclusion and fear, but fear doesn't build communities. It destroys them. The room was silent, every eye fixed on the two men. Daniel's anger boiled over, and he took a step toward Jamal, his voice rising. You're not going to ruin what I've worked for, not here, not ever. Jamal stood his ground, his voice calm but filled with resolve. You've already ruined it yourself, Daniels. The recording, the documents, your actions are your legacy now, and they prove exactly why this town needs to change. Margaret raised her gavel, her voice cutting through the tension. Enough, Officer Daniels. You've been accused of serious misconduct, and this council has no choice but to suspend you pending an independent investigation. The gallery erupted in a mix of cheers and angry shouts. Daniels turned to the council, his face a mask of disbelief. You can't do this. I've served this town for decades. Then you should have served it with integrity, Margaret replied coldly. As Daniels was escorted out by two deputies, Jamal felt a surge of vindication, but the battle wasn't over. He turned back to the council, his voice steady. The community center isn't just about addressing the symptoms of bias. It's about fixing the system that allowed them to thrive in the first place. I urge you to reconsider your decision and support this project. Not for me, but for the future of Millbrook. Margaret glanced at her fellow council members, their faces a mixture of guilt and uncertainty. "We'll review the proposal again," she said finally. "But this will take time." Jamal nodded. "Take all the time you need, I'm not going anywhere." As the meeting adjourned, Jamal stepped outside into the cool evening air. A small crowd of supporters had gathered, cheering as he emerged. Mitchell joined him, his expression a mix of relief and determination. "You handled that well," Mitchell said. "But Daniels isn't the only one resisting this. There are still plenty of people in this town who don't want to see things change." "I know," Jamal replied, "but this is a start, and sometimes that's all you need." He looked out at the crowd, his resolve hardening. The fight for Millbrook was far from over, but he wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The hum of voices in Millbrook's town square was loud enough to rival the early morning cicadas. A crowd had gathered outside the courthouse, the tension palpable as people waited for the town council's decision. Inside, Jamal Carter stood at the center of the chamber, his back straight and his hands resting on the polished wood of the defense table. Across from him, Officer Daniels leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed and his eyes narrowed in smug defiance. Jamal had been here before. Not this exact room, but this exact situation. Standing toe-to-toe with power, wielded by someone who believed they could bend the truth to their will. Daniels, however, had underestimated Jamal's resolve. "Order, please," called Margaret Caldwell, her voice sharp as she banged her gavel. "We'll hear both sides before rendering a final decision on the community center and the recent allegations brought against Officer Daniels." Daniels leaned forward, his chair creaking under his weight. "With all due respect, Madam President, I don't see what allegations have to do with this project. The real issue here is whether a project like Mr. Carter's is even appropriate for a town like Millbrook." Jamal raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He knew better than to interrupt. Daniels was walking straight into his own trap. Margaret cleared her throat. "Mr. Carter, the floor is yours to respond." Jamal stood, smoothing his jacket as he walked to the podium. He felt the weight of the room's eyes, the expectation thick in the air. "Thank you, Madam President," he began, his voice steady. "I'm here today not just to defend this community center, but to confront the real issue, an issue we've all seen but been too afraid to name. It's not about zoning laws or community disruption. It's about who we choose to include in the future of Millbrook." Daniel smirked, shaking his head. "Here we go again." Jamal turned to him, his gaze unwavering. "Yes, here we go again. Because this isn't just about a building, Officer Daniels. It's about how you've used your position to undermine progress and perpetuate exclusion." The room erupted into murmurs. Daniel's face flushed, but he forced a smirk. "Big accusations, Carter. Got any proof to back them up?" Jamal glanced at Mitchell Harper, who nodded and stepped forward with a thick folder. He placed it on the council's table, and Margaret began flipping through its contents. Her face hardened with each page. "These documents," Jamal continued, "detail a pattern of behavior. False reports, fabricated complaints, and an abuse of power, meant to intimidate anyone who challenges the status quo. And it doesn't stop there." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a tap, the audio of Daniel's hot mic recording filled the room. "This Carter guy thinks he can just waltz in here and tell us what to do. We don't need his kind in Millbrook. If it takes bending the rules to keep him out, so be it." Gasps rippled through the room. Daniels's face turned a deep shade of red, and his composure cracked. "That's out of context," he shouted, slamming a fist on the table. "You don't know what we were discussing." Margaret held up a hand to quiet the room. "Officer Daniels, this is serious. These documents and the recording suggest a deliberate attempt to obstruct progress and manipulate public perception." Daniels shot to his feet, his voice rising. "I did what I had to do to protect this town. Carter and his kind don't belong here. They'll ruin everything we've built." The room fell silent. Daniels had gone too far, and he knew it. Jamal took a step closer to the council table, his voice calm but firm. "That's the truth, isn't it? This isn't about the town. It's about your fear of change, of losing control. But this town doesn't belong to you. It belongs to everyone who lives here." Daniels's lip curled into a sneer. "Big talk from a man who doesn't even understand what this town stands for." Jamal met his gaze, unflinching. I understand exactly what it stands for, and that's why it needs to change. The council chamber was thick with tension. Margaret exchanged glances with the other council members, then turned to Daniels. Officer Daniels, you've overstepped your authority in a way that cannot be ignored. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending a full investigation. The room erupted into a mix of cheers and shouts. Daniels slammed his chair backward and stormed toward the exit, but he stopped at the door, pointing a finger at Jamal. This isn't over, he snarled. You think you've won, but people like me don't back down. Jamal watched him go, his expression unreadable. He turned back to the council, his voice steady. The question now is, what will you do to move this town forward? The community center is about more than bricks and mortar. It's about giving Millbrook a future worth believing in. Margaret nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. Mr. Carter, we'll need time to review everything presented here today. But I will say this. The tide is turning. Thank you for your persistence. Jamal stepped away from the podium, his chest heavy with both relief and uncertainty. The fight wasn't over, but a crucial battle had been won. As Jamal left the courthouse, the crowd outside erupted in applause. Reporters shouted questions, but Jamal ignored them, his focus on the next steps. He was halfway to his car when a familiar voice stopped him. You think you're a hero? Jamal turned to see Daniels standing by the corner of the building, his face twisted with rage. He approached slowly, his movements calculated. You don't get it, do you? Daniels hissed. This town doesn't want you, they'll never accept you. Jamal stood his ground, his voice calm. This town doesn't need to accept me, it needs to accept progress. Daniels took a step closer, his voice low and venomous. People like you think you can waltz in with your money and your ideas, but you don't belong here. And I'll make sure you never do. Jamal met his gaze, unflinching. You've already lost, Daniels. The people see you for who you really are now. Your time is over. Daniels sneered but said nothing more. He turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy against the pavement. As Jamal climbed into his car, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. The confrontation had been intense, but it was only the beginning. The fight for the community center, and the fight for Millbrook's future, was far from over. Jamal stared out the window at the courthouse, his resolve hardening. This isn't the end, he murmured to himself. It's just the start. The fallout from the council meeting spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By morning, the recording of Officer Daniels' remarks had gone viral, amplified by regional news outlets covering the heated town debate. The once quiet streets buzzed with conversations about corruption, inclusion, and what it truly meant to belong in a community. For the first time, Millbrook seemed to be questioning its identity. Jamal Carter sat in his office, staring at the headlines scrolling across his tablet. Millbrook officer suspended amid corruption scandal. Local businessman exposes systemic bias in small town, and community demands action after damning allegations. The press coverage had turned the tide of public opinion in a way Jamal hadn't anticipated. What began as a personal battle to build a community center had sparked a much larger conversation. Mr. Carter? Erica's voice interrupted his thoughts as she entered the room. Mitchell Harper is on the line. He says it's important. Jamal nodded, picking up the phone. Mitchell. What's the latest? Mitchell's voice was brisk but hopeful. The council's reconvening today for a vote on the community center. After everything that's come to light, the opposition has crumbled. Even Margaret Caldwell is backing you now. Jamal leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. That's good to hear. But what about Daniels? He's not going to go quietly. No, he won't, Mitchell admitted. But the council's planning to recommend his permanent removal from the force. There's too much evidence against him, and the community is demanding accountability. The man's done. Jamal closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of Mitchell's words sink in. Daniel's downfall wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for everyone who had been silenced or excluded by people like Daniels. I appreciate the update, Jamal said finally. Let me know how the vote goes. By late afternoon, the town hall was packed once again, but this time, the energy was different. Supporters of the community center filled the gallery, their presence a testament to the growing momentum behind Jamal's vision. Mitchell waved to Jamal as he entered, and Margaret Caldwell greeted him with a faint smile, a significant shift from her previous wariness. "We've heard enough," Margaret announced, her voice carrying over the room's murmurs. "Let's move directly to the vote." The process was swift, and when the final tally was read, 7 in favor, 2 against, the room erupted in cheers. Jamal allowed himself a small smile as Mitchell patted him on the back. "It's official," Mitchell said. "You did it." "No," Jamal replied, his voice firm. "We did it." The council's decision marked the end of Daniel's reign in Millbrook. The investigation into his actions unearthed years of misconduct, from falsified reports to intimidation tactics aimed at maintaining control over the town. By the end of the week, Daniels had resigned under pressure, his reputation in ruins. Jamal didn't gloat. Watching Daniels's fall was bittersweet, a reminder of how deeply rooted the town's biases were and how much work remained. But it was a step forward, and that was enough for now. In the weeks following the vote, construction on the community center resumed. This time with overwhelming community support, Jamal was a frequent presence on site, not just as a businessman overseeing a project, but as a neighbor investing in Millbrook's future. One morning, as he watched a crew install the frame for the center's main hall, Claire Adams, a local teacher who had been an early supporter of the project, approached him. "You know," she said, handing him a cup of coffee, "I wasn't sure how this would all turn out, but seeing the way people have come together for this, it's inspiring." Jamal nodded, his gaze on the rising structure. Change takes time, and it's never easy, but when it happens, it's worth every fight. Claire studied him for a moment. "You've done more than just build a community center, Jamal. You've shown this town what's possible when someone refuses to give up." Jamal smiled, though the weight of her words settled heavily on him. "I didn't do it alone. People like you, Mitchell, and others. You made it possible." Systemic change. The opening of the Millbrook Community Center marked a turning point for the town. The building itself was stunning, a modern design that blended seamlessly with the town's historic charm. But it was what the center represented that truly mattered: a space for education, recreation, and community building, open to everyone. The center's programs quickly became a lifeline for Millbrook. Free tutoring for students, job training workshops, and cultural events drew people from all walks of life. For the first time, the town's divisions seemed to soften, replaced by a shared sense of purpose. Jamal watched the transformation with quiet pride. The center was proof that progress was possible, even in a place resistant to change. Emotional closure. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the community center, Jamal sat on a bench outside the building, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about the battles he'd fought, the indignities, the resistance, the doubts, and how each had shaped him. Mitchell joined him, sitting down with a tired but satisfied sigh. "The place looks incredible," he said, nodding toward the center. "You should be proud." "I am," Jamal replied. "But this isn't just about me, it's about what this town can be." Mitchell chuckled. "Still, the idealist." "Someone has to be," Jamal said with a smile. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Mitchell spoke again. "What's next for you, Jamal? You've done something incredible here, but I can't imagine you're done." Jamal considered the question, his mind already racing with possibilities. "There's always more to do. More communities like Millbrook that need support. This is just the beginning." As the first stars appeared in the evening sky, Jamal felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in months. The fight for Millbrook had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated, but it had also shown him what was possible when people stood together against injustice. He rose from the bench, his gaze fixed on the community center. "This isn't just a building," he said softly. "It's a reminder that change is possible, if we're willing to fight for it." Mitchell nodded, standing with him. "And I have no doubt you'll keep fighting." As Jamal walked to his car, the hum of laughter and conversation from inside the center filled the air. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. This was only the beginning. The soft hum of conversation filled the Millbrook Community Center as families gathered for its inaugural celebration. Children darted between tables set with refreshments, their laughter echoing through the main hall. In the corner, a group of elders chatted over cups of coffee, their faces lit with curiosity as they explored the new space. The atmosphere was alive with hope, a stark contrast to the tension that had defined the town just weeks earlier. Jamal Carter stood near the entrance, quietly observing. His journey to this moment had been anything but easy. The resistance, the personal attacks, and the systemic barriers he'd faced had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated. But as he looked out at the bustling crowd, he knew it had all been worth it. For Jamal, the struggle for the community center had been more than just a fight to build a structure. It had been a battle to prove that progress was possible, even in places resistant to change. Along the way, he'd discovered depths of resilience he hadn't known he possessed. He'd learned that true leadership wasn't about standing above others, but standing with them, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Looking back, Jamal realized how much he had grown. He was no longer just a businessman with a vision. He was a catalyst for change. His ordeal had taught him patience and the power of persistence. It had shown him the importance of allies, like Mitchell Harper and Claire Adams, who had stepped forward when it mattered most. It had reaffirmed his belief that progress wasn't just about building something tangible, but about creating spaces where people felt seen, heard, and valued. The fight for Millbrook's community center wasn't just a local story. It was a reflection of the systemic issues that plagued countless towns and cities across the country. The resistance Jamal had faced, the microaggressions, the abuse of power, the entrenched biases, were symptoms of a much larger problem. They were reminders of how deeply rooted fear and prejudice could be, and how those in power often weaponized them to maintain control. But the story also revealed something else: the power of collective action. When people like Mitchell, Claire, and the townsfolk who eventually rallied behind Jamal came together, they showed that change was possible. They proved that even in the face of systemic challenges, progress could be made when individuals refused to back down. Jamal's victory was a reminder that dismantling injustice required more than just one person's effort. It required a community willing to challenge its own assumptions and work towards something greater. As Jamal took the stage to address the crowd, the room fell silent. He looked out at the faces before him, some familiar, some new. The weight of the moment settled over him, but so did its potential. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady but warm. "This center is more than a building. It's a promise, a commitment to the future of Millbrook. It's a space for learning, growth, and connection. But most importantly, it's a reminder of what we can achieve when we stand together." The crowd erupted into applause, but Jamal held up a hand, urging quiet. "I won't pretend the journey here was easy. There were times when I doubted whether this dream could become a reality. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that progress is never easy. It's uncomfortable, it's messy, and it's often met with resistance." He paused, letting his words settle. "But progress is also necessary. It challenges us to grow, to question, and to build a better future. Not just for ourselves, but for the generations that come after us." Jamal's gaze swept the room. "This isn't the end of the journey, it's the beginning, and I hope this center serves as a reminder that change is possible, no matter how daunting it may seem." The crowd rose to their feet, their applause filling the hall. For Jamal, the moment wasn't just a celebration of what had been achieved, it was a call to action for what was still to come. As the evening wound down, Jamal found himself standing outside the center. The cool night air, a welcome contrast to the warmth of the event. Claire joined him, her expression thoughtful. "You did it," she said simply, handing him a cup of tea. "We did it," Jamal corrected, a faint smile on his lips. "This wouldn't have been possible without the people who believed in the vision." Claire nodded. "Still, it's something to be proud of. Not just the center, but what it represents." Jamal looked up at the stars, his thoughts drifting. "It's a start. But there's so much more to do. This center is just one piece of the puzzle. There are still barriers to break, minds to change, and systems to challenge. And you'll be at the forefront," Claire said with certainty. "People are watching, Jamal. They're inspired." Jamal's smile widened, but his eyes remained serious. "That's what I hope for. that this inspires others to fight their own battles, to stand up when it feels impossible, because progress isn't about one person, it's about all of us. As Jamal drove home that night, his mind buzzed with ideas for the future. The success of the community center had proven what was possible, but it had also revealed how much work remained. He thought about other towns like Millbrook, places struggling under the weight of outdated systems and entrenched biases. He thought about the children who would benefit from the programs at the center and the generations that would follow. Jamal knew his journey was far from over. The fight for progress was ongoing, and he was determined to keep pushing forward. The community center was a victory, but it was also a challenge. To himself, to Millbrook, and to anyone watching. Keep building, keep fighting, keep believing. As he pulled into his driveway and stepped out of the car, Jamal felt a deep sense of peace. He looked up at the night sky, the stars shining brightly above, and whispered to himself, "This is just the beginning."